Thank you, everybody, for returning, and thank you to the committee members. You'll notice that we've handed out a very coveted Island Trust pen as our token appreciation for you coming. But thank you for taking time out of your busy days and expenses for travel to get here. Appreciate that very much. Some of our panel need to leave for an 11:45 flight, so they're going to leave here at 11:30 promptly. And so that's primarily the Port Authority folks. So that's Captain Dahlgren and other members from Transport Canada, from Port of Metro Vancouver. And so perhaps we'll focus the initial questions to them, and the other members have agreed to stay a little longer because we do have a little bit of extra time at the end of our schedule because we've been so efficient earlier today. So let's, I'm going to start my speakers list here, and I'll look at the trustees to see for questions. And so I'm going to start with Brian Crumbleview from Ulster.
Okay, I'll start. It's not a question, it's a statement, and I'm going to solicit responses. And I will not, I'm not going to discuss ethics of increased traffic or whatever, or resource extraction. Specifically on marine safety, my statement is that we're not safe now. Never mind for increased tanker traffic. What I've heard are some very, very laudable goals. I think they're really terrific. I think they're doing a fantastic job. My concern is that this is industry-driven because of the profit, and this is a focus on the very large, particularly very large vessels. I completely understand the economics of scale, and certainly one large spill would be a disaster. I would also argue that there's a lot of small vessels that do not fit in that category. And a lot of small spills would also be a cumulative disaster. That's what you might call, if you'll pardon the dreadful metaphor, it's death by 1,000 spills. I was, 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting or a workshop with the WCMRC, yet another one. We've had a number of them. And the story is exactly the same. They have fabulous equipment, and they're in 3 major locations. I was there with also 4 members of the Maine Island Conservancy, so we've been through these discussions many times. I am almost there.
I'm going to set a standard right at the moment. Okay. Let's try and get to a question.
Okay. Okay, I'll skip all of the middle analysis and suggest that what we need is the equivalent of a 911 call-out system so that anybody, any eyes on the water, will get a very rapid response. We need local bases, not bases that are an hour or several hours away. We have very, very rapid tide changes on the islands.
No question?
No, I said at the beginning, that's a statement, so I was soliciting a response.
Okay. Any response?
I wonder if it's more effective to take a few and see if there are any clustering, or how would you like to do?
That's what my intention is. I'd like questions for the panel that's here. And so I'm actually going to start, because there were so many hands that showed. Melanie Mimosa was the first hand I saw at that end, and then I'm going to work my way around the table. So, Melanie?
Yeah. Okay.
The public
You have to pass it over to her.
Is the public going to be allowed to speak?
The intention is for trustees to be able to ask the question?
Is the public going to be allowed to speak?
No. Not unless there's time at the end.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. As I say, my name is Melanie Mimosa, and I'm a trustee of Gabriel Island, so I have a lot of interest in the proposed anchorages on the northeast side. And I do have a specific question, but I do want to take a quick opportunity to explain to you why those anchorages are very important, are a big concern to our residents. The northeast side of Gabriel has one of our most important provincial parks that bring a lot of people there to recreate, and those boats will be right in that viewpoint, right near that bay. We have over 100 residential properties right on that coastline, and reading through some of the documents assessing the risks of anchorages and the reasons for mitigating those risks and moving some out of Plumper Sound and Cowichan Bay has to do with the direct impact from exhaust, lights, noise on residents. We have lots of residents that live there. Also, I think that's the most important fishing ground, recreational fishing grounds in the area. Our local hockey teams called the Gabriel Grandes because of that area. That is the Grandes for us. That is where we fish. That's where we recreate. That's where we kayak. So what about our right to use those waters for our navigation? So I just want to start with that. But I thought it was great to hear from Robert Louis Manning about this opportunity to look right now at how we decide where anchorages are designated and the process for doing that, and an opportunity for assessing the cumulative effect and impacts of the increase in vessel traffic, if there is, but how we designate these anchorages. And I was wondering about what process could be taken, or if there's one planned by Transport Canada now to do such a thorough assessment. Because I've read through what the Pacific Palliative Authority has done and is designated and looked at these anchorages and identifying them as good spots. And I don't find it comprehensive at all. So I'd like to see something more comprehensive around planning for the future of vessel traffic in this area. There's a question.
There was a question?
Yeah, to Transport Canada around the process for assessing the cumulative effects of the proposed increase in vessel traffic in the area. Like that, this is a time we're hearing is a moment that we could look at and pause and assess how we do our business in designating anchorages, and I want to hear about that. And our rights, and the public, our local rights to navigation versus those of these big ships.
Do you want me to respond now?
Please, yeah.
Yeah.
Is there Thanks, Melanie. So actually, Brian, Melanie, your questions and your statement and question in some ways are linked a little bit. Just in a couple of respects. First, people report spills or matters on the water in multiple ways, but the most common for vessels or planes is actually that they contact Coast Guard Marine Traffic. It was actually in the center of Sydney yesterday, and they received multiple reports from all over the region, and they then notify appropriately, do the call-outs and do that. And it works not perfectly, but fairly well. And in a municipal area, if somebody spots from a beach, they'll tend to call 911, and then those responders make so Coast Guard is a big part of that. In terms of how response is done and whether we need more geographically localized response capability, are we a perfect response system? I'm reluctant to say that we'll, at any given moment, no matter how good it was, I don't think I would ever answer you if it's a perfect system, right? I mean, it's a journey that to get better, and technology will change, and exogenous factors in the risk environment change, tolerance changes, a bunch of things change, and we have to be on a journey of constant improvement around prevention, around response on both sides of remediation. So that's an ongoing process. And actually, Transport with Coast Guard has launched one, and I'm happy to be able to share the podium with somebody else. But Tim is actually the lead for what we're calling the area response planning. And that's an opportunity for communities, for First Nations, for the different regulatory authorities, for municipal governments, in some cases, to engage, to provide science, traditional and local knowledge that is going to shape a more detailed schema. We're trying this in 5 places in the country, and this coast starting with the South Coast, and it will get expanded, and it will get refined, and it will keep getting refined. WCMCRC, Western Canada, I always get too many C's in there, but Western Canada Marine Response Corporation is doing really neat stuff. They've got a GIS specialist who's going out on the water with First Nations. They're mapping the traditional knowledge, the culturally specific sites, so that they can prioritize if something happens, how they protect ecosystem, but also culturally sensitive areas for First Nations. They're doing that with communities on the boats. But some really neat stuff. The system is getting better at this. Not perfect, but everything's on the right track, I think. I feel like echoing now.
Yeah.
So that work is going on. You're invited to be a part of it. It's rolling out. Tim can probably bore you to tears on it. Maybe not bore me to tears. But anyway, there's a channel for doing that. In terms of does one type of vessel have priority over another economically? No, it doesn't. So there has to be a balance. There's room for everybody in this ecosystem. We have to find a way for that to happen. And so we don't isolate areas. It's not a triumph of one over the other. There's different types of activity. They all have to figure out a way to coexist. And the role of Transport Canada is to figure out a way for it to coexist safely. Hope that answers.
Just the plan planning aspect. But
Thank
Well,
you.
the area response plan.
I want to provide an opportunity for all the trustees that have questions to ask questions. So I think there's a couple of things I'd like to point out is that our guests are not government, although they may work for government. They don't make decisions about policy or regulation. They may advise, and so let's be respectful of our guests, that they're the messengers of the government's policy and the court's policy. And I think it's going to be important to really try and focus on questions of clarity or information that you want. Not that your position on something isn't important, but I think if we maximize the time and provide the opportunity for all the trustees to have a question. And so the next person that has asked to ask a question is Tim Peterson from Misty.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming today. Given what you were just mentioning about the Coast Guard being the first area of reporting, the first spills and response, I'm wondering, given that the discussion of the Coast Guard station at Co-ops being closed down as a concern for a number of people in the area, and it seems like a step backwards from the outside point of view, and I'm wondering if you have a comment on that.
Bring that microphone back.
Well, hold it close.
This needs to be held close and it won't be echoed.
Oh, okay.
So this is a Coast Guard issue, but it's become a political one. But let me take the politics out of it to the best of my ability. I've visited the Marine Traffic Control, MCTS, Marine Traffic Control Communications. Marine, yeah, okay, that thing. We're the people who talk on the radio to you from the Coast Guard. It's an operations center. It's a whole bunch of big screens. They can speak to you and receive from different VHF towers located on the mountaintops up and down BC's coast, and indeed right to the Arctic or the East Coast if they had to. The reality of technology is it's all telemetry. You could do this from Winnipeg. I say that because I'm from Winnipeg, but you could do it from anywhere. Technology is enabling that. There's no response coming out of there. What's important is that you have people in those centers who have some knowledge of the local areas, and they do. So where the radios are housed is all that's kind of changed. They just consolidated where the radios are housed. It has no impact on the level of safety and security.
Just for clarity, so there was no response from that station prior to closing down? It was strictly a radio center?
Correct.
All right, so let's keep coming around the room here. I think Janine Dawes, did you have a question? Main Island?
Main Island, I just have a really simple question. Why can't the offloading of the gypsum in Plumper Sound, which is, there's videotape of what's happening there today with that dust, why cannot that just simply be relocated to an area where it's not such a nuisance to neighbors and the environment there?
I thought that might come up, so I was inquiring with my staff this morning. So I've become aware of this. It's a Canada Steamship Lines vessel apparently that does this. What I'm told, and I'm happy to go back, is that we last looked at this in response to some complaints in 2012 or 2013, so I think from this table. So gypsum is not classified as a marine pollutant. And I'm not a chemist. I don't make this stuff up, but it's not classified as a marine pollutant. If there's an identified safety concern, then we could look at what we can do. If it's a matter of being an irritant, what we can sometimes do, and I gather have done in the past, is meet with the ship's agent or the operator and see if there's steps they can take to try to minimize that. I am told that they have done things around noise, light, hours of operation, that sort of thing, but I'm happy to have that conversation with you and get an update. The only thing I would flag is that sometimes where I sit, what people want is to get the NIMBY problem out of their backyard, but put it into somebody else's backyard, and that isn't actually sort of a long-term fix to something, but I'm happy to have a conversation if there's something we can do there we can be in.
Briefly going to say from my side of the channel, which is Main Island, it looks to me like it's constantly getting closer and closer to South Pender Island. I don't know if that's the case, but it seems to me that the location has actually changed to be closer to
South Canada.
I don't know, but I'm happy to talk to you about it.
Yeah, let's move to the next person that had a question. This side of Janine, who is that next? Sue Ellen Fast from Bone Island Municipality.
My question concerns SIGTO, this is International Society of Gas Tankers and Terminal Operators, and I'm wondering, in the regulatory regime that you talked about from Transport Canada, one of the SIGTO recommendations that's based on 50 years of safe shipping so far, are the SIGTO recommendations included in Canada's legal network, I think you called it, or recommendations? And also, what about the, for example, 1.2e, short approach channels are preferable to long inshore routes which carry more numerous hazards. That doesn't seem to fit our situation in Howe Sound with the proposed wood fiber mill. If pilots come on 180 kilometers away or outside of Victoria. So my question is about the SIGTO recommendations and guidelines, the international standards, are they included in Canada's regulations? Or ways of doing things? I guess you didn't say that.
I'm going to ask the panel if anybody else knows the answer to that. I don't have that level of detailed knowledge.
SIGTO is an association that basically looks after the gas tanker fleet. So is ISGOT is an association that looks after the oil tanker fleet. And they have, let's say, association guidelines on safe operations, and that is usually these guidelines are adhered to by the shipper in the shipping line. What, for example, we have done as a port authority, we have adopted some of the ISGOT guidelines into our rules and regulations. So we are able to go above and beyond the regulations that are set by Transport Canada and devise regulations within the port's jurisdiction. And we have, for example, taken ISGOT guidelines and made them into regulations within our jurisdiction.
Thank you. Let's go to the next person in this direction.
I'm Sir Chairman, can I just add one point to that?
Please.
The important point that Mr. Wellstood's making is inside of the port's jurisdiction. They have gone to a higher regulatory regime based on best practices identified by the industry under their ability, under the Port Operations Regulations, under the Canada Marine Act, to put in place an additional. And that is one reason why it's beneficial to have a port authority, because they can go to a higher standard at the request of their user groups.
Thank you. We don't have a port authority. My question was more for Transport Canada around SIGTO, and maybe I'll follow up with you later. If that's all right. Thank you.
So, Kate Louise Stanford, do you have a question?
Yeah, I've got two quick questions. How does Clear Seas fit into what you're doing at all the different levels? And in regards to term poll, I understand it's a voluntary guideline for LNG shipping. It includes LNG shipping. What is the ultimate authority if something goes wrong with one of the LNG proposed ships coming out of Howe Sound? Who's going to take responsibility for that?
Okay, so I'll just quickly answer the question about Clear Seas, first of all. The Vancouver Fraser Port Authority recognized that there was a lack of good quality scientific research and information about the impact of marine shipping on wildlife and so on. And so we canvassed the support of several, including Transport Canada, to fund the initiation of Clear Seas. And so Clear Seas is funded by a number of organizations, but it is a completely independent organization. It's now totally on its own. And its function is to work with scientific researchers to commission studies, gather information, and create that body of knowledge that port authorities and others will rely on in creating regulations and that kind of thing.
Thank you. Heather O'Sullivan.
Term polls? There was a question about term polls.
Oh, is there a second question?
Sure. Term poll is it's a voluntary process. That said, if you're industry, it probably isn't feeling very voluntary right now, and that everybody does it. And then in practice, what's happening because it's voluntary, it doesn't have a statutory enforceability. But what's happening to give it that is we're finding that the National Energy Board in approving the energy projects is taking that term pool recommendation and making it a requirement of condition of license. And so it does have that statutory authority. So people end up being accountable to the National Energy Board and that entire regime for complying with the conditions of license. Sure.
Why don't we just pass the mic back and forth? So one final point to that is that although it's a voluntary process, you cannot get permission from the British Columbia Coastal Pilots and the Pacific Pilots Authority to have a review to allow them to move the ships, which they're required to do by law, unless you have a turn pole. So de facto, the PPA has made a regulatory regime on the marine side as well as the land side of the National Energy Board.
Thank you. Heather O'Sullivan, Gabriel Island.
Okay, so I'm primarily aiming this at Transport Canada, and I appreciate the clarity that you provided around anchoring rights under the public right of navigation, but the fact remains that these large vessels do in general use designated anchorages, and so of course my island's concern remains around the proposed anchorages. And if Transport Canada does decide, this is a bit of a twofold question, if Transport Canada does decide to move forward with establishing new anchorages, then I'm really interested to know what legal authority you rely on to establish those anchorages. And it's my understanding that one of the potential mechanisms for establishing anchorages is if the jurisdiction of the Nanaimo Port Authority were extended, then that would, I've been through the letters patent of the NPA, and that gives them some sweeping authority, including establishing anchorages and in fact many other facilities. So at the same time, the letters patent does not have, it doesn't have a lot of conditions in terms of requirements for environmental protection, marine safety, oil spill response, community consultation, etc. So if Transport Canada does consider amending the letters patent for the Nanaimo Port Authority to extend the jurisdiction, would you also consider amending the letters patent to include some of those very important marine protections?
Okay, so thanks for the question, because as I said, there's some issues of verbs. Identifying an anchorage, creating an anchorage, establishing an anchorage, designating an anchorage. Transport Canada has no authority to establish or create or designate an anchorage. None. Under the Canada Shipping Act of 2001, Transport Canada, and indeed no one, has that authority. The status is that under the Canada Shipping Act of 2001, there is a common law right to navigation, and any vessel can anchor anywhere that it is safe. So the situation is this, and why the language gets confusing is that within a port authority's boundary, the port under the Canada Marine Act does have the authority to establish anchorages. So in simple terms, there are two governing pieces of legislation. There's the Canada Marine Act, which is largely an economically based piece of legislation that establishes Canada Port Authorities, among other things, but largely the statutes under which they operate. Where there is a Canada Port Authority, that Port Authority is given the legal authority to assert positive control over their space, on land and on water. They can put up fences, they can keep people out, federal police have jurisdiction, etc. And on the water, Port Police, Port Authority, Harbour Master have jurisdiction. They can tell a ship where to go, when to go, how to go there, how to stay securely there, and everything that they're going to do there pretty much. Chris can detain a vessel, Ed can detain a vessel, he can tell them they can't move at night, he can tell them they can only move under tow, he can tell them what channel. Positive control. So a port can establish a designated anchorage zone within their waters, and to some extent for a vessel destined for that port, but outside their waters, because they got some control and influence over the vessel. The vessel's going to go along, because if they don't, they're not going to get to come to port. It's basically kind of the way it works. They can also, importantly, charge within their jurisdiction. And this is important, because I know some people have talked about, well, why don't we fix the supply chain and the economic incentives and disincentives? A port authority can do that within its jurisdiction under the Canada Marine Act. in that positive controlled space. Anything outside of Canada Port Authority, which is currently the situation off Gabriola, but also Pumper Sound and other places, is governed by that international regime that I talked about, enabled under Canadian law through the Canada Shipping Act. And in that case, it's only negative control. We can only, as Transport Canada is the regulator, and Coast Guard implements this on the water on our behalf. They're the operational arm of transport. Well, they operationalize the Transport Canada regs. They used to be part of transport. They can only, we can only tell somebody not to do something because it's unsafe. Otherwise, fair game. And that common law right of navigation and of anchorage is the same one that those of you with recreational vessels, if you go on a camping trip with your family and weigh anchor and put down and swim, that's what you're exercising. You actually can't necessarily do that within a Port Authority's boundaries for the same reason. So as we expand that authority, we start to assert the control over everything. Along with that comes the ability to equalize the economics, to motivate or disincentivize behaviors, and to provide oversight for enhanced safety and security, which I think is your fundamental concern. So to be clear about what would happen if the letters patent to expand the boundaries of the Nanaimo Port Authority, it actually could result in less probability of those anchorages being used than is currently the case. Because right now, anybody can go there and anchor so long as it's safe. But if the Nanaimo Port Authority has the control, they can actually dictate who can use it under what circumstances and when, in combination with renamed, rebranded, the port formerly known as Port Metro Vancouver. And they can charge for it and deploy resources to provide oversight and penalties and so on and so forth. So does that help to answer the distinction on that? I know it's a bit of a soliloquy on language.
I have difficulty, what I hear you saying is that if the port's boundaries were expanded and the anchorages were designated, there would be less chance of their being used. However, since they are not current, since that area is currently being used for anchoring, I have a hard time seeing my way clear to what you're saying, which is that if it was designated as an anchorage, it wouldn't be used.
Sure, but I think where vessels are going right now has to do with actually the reduced volumes of traffic right now for the reasons that you heard. Were this 2 years ago, and if you had the increase about the vessels that are larger size, they can't use a bunch of those former anchorage locations that they commonly used. Like in practice, what happens is that the pilot on board the ship, working with the ship's agent and the vessel master, determines where it's safest to go. And Transport Canada's concern fundamentally is that vessels be safe so that we don't have accident spills, loss of life, loss of and pollution. Right, so those vessels could go there. The intention, I think I can speak to this, it is not terribly efficient to have ships at anchor for economic reasons. And if they are going to be at anchor, it's more efficient and lower cost to have them closer to where they need to berth and then exit correctly. So there's not a lot of economic motivation, especially if these can be equalized. So it's not a free right of anchorage out here in the Gulf as compared to in the port. There's less economic incentive for ships to want to stay there. But I would be careful in describing a lack of present activity to the regime. I think it's owing, in fact, to the current state of traffic.
And the other question which I asked, which you perhaps didn't get a chance to address, was the idea of including environmental protection, marine safety, oil spill response, community consultation requirements, and so on within the letters patent.
I am not sufficiently an expert in the exact legal regime of that to comment on whether that would be done by this patent. I do know that the ports, acting as a crown entity, already have significant obligations for duty to consult with First Nations, for communities, and all the rest. And Robert Lisman is going to save me on this.
I just wanted to highlight that Transport Canada is doing a consultation right now about a lot of the things you're concerned about. So there's a big focus on ports. So if you don't have that information, we'll make sure you have it afterwards. Because I think a lot of the things you're discussing are all related to to what they're looking for information. So that's not paid for by Transport Canada. I just thought, if you don't know, you should know.
Transportation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Captain Dahlgren had a response there, and then we'll go to the next question.
Thank you for the question, because it lets us understand where the confusion might be or the lack of our successful communication. The oil spill response, no matter whether it's in a port or not, is ultimately responsible to the Canadian Coast Guard as designated by Transport Canada. It doesn't matter where it is in Canada, the Coast Guard is the lead agent. Then it's followed by the Shipboard Oil Pollution Plan, which is a requirement under Canadian law for the ships to have in place a guarantor who is going to respond to any spill that they create, because polluter pays, that's international Canadian law. And the ports have put in place their own spill response capability to bridge any gap in time between the mobilization of distant resources that have been previously identified to do a quick hit. So each of the ports puts in place an oil pollution regime to bridge the gap pending the arrival of the Coast Guard's oversight and the boots on the ground from Western Canada Marine Response Corporation. So those are federal responsibilities, not port responsibilities. We augment and support the federal entities, but we do not exceed our boundaries. Any new activity a port is required to undertake, they must provide meaningful consultation. And we have to get permission for that from Transport Canada, which checks and confirms that there has been meaningful dialogue and adequate consultation. The intent is not to create an opaque organization, but one that is fully transparent and responsive to the needs of the user groups. Social license is a key component of Canadian legislation regime.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question, Dan Rogers.
Thanks. I think this is directed at the federal entities, in the center of most of them. My question is, it's pretty obvious from what you've been telling us, that a lot of the regulatory regime was based on a commercial foundation for the marine traffic industry and not so much based on, and a lot of the concerns that are being raised now are environmental and concerns about habitat and concerns about communities, etc. And there doesn't seem to be, they don't seem to be matching up all that well. And I'm wondering, my question is what can you tell us about what work is being done to look at the kind of cumulative effects of this growth? We're in a region, as someone pointed out, where 8 million people live, and the stresses are becoming obvious, and there seems to be a lot of, there is a lot of impetus towards more economic development, more shipping, etc. And we seem to be working off a regime from the 1920s, which never recognized the environmental regulations. I appreciate a lot of the processes are updated, but a lot of the regimes may not have been. What can you tell us about what the federal government in particular is doing in terms of looking at the cumulative effects of all of this proposed impact of all this shipping on the airshed, on the marine environment, etc., and so that we can have a reasonable discussion about when enough might be enough, as opposed to a non-stop growth of shipping, despite the current lull that might be existing. So, is there that conversation occurring at the federal level, and if so, where and who should we be talking to?
I'll offer a perspective on some of that, but in fact, there's so much going on. I would never pretend to have my arms sort of around all of it. There's a lot going on internationally as well, and Canada's a leader in some of that. We're present. Talking to somebody in Ottawa the other day, it's literally that we have somebody going over to London every week for the plethora of meetings and discussions at the IMO, because you have to move the world together. You can't have a fragmented regime. Although in some aspects we have taken more proactive approaches. Ships, for instance, switch to low sulfur diesel when they enter Canada's economic exclusion zone. For some of those reasons. So to some extent where we can, we have implemented some differentiated regimes. On the cumulative effects and the broader studies, there's a lot of science and research going on. Clear Seas, which Robin spoke about, is doing some. Oceans Network Canada is doing others. Fisheries and Oceans, Environment Canada and Climate Change, a lot of science out of UBC, also out of Dalhousie and the Bedford Institute and other places. So there's lots of work going on intended to inform better and better decision-making and understanding the impacts. And there's interesting things coming out of that too, because sometimes the evidence isn't what people think it's going to be. In fact, one of the can I talk about the greatest offender, Danielle? Am I allowed? The largest source of noise damaging to marine habitat here, I believe, according to sort of the latest research, is actually ferries. It's not the commercial vessels. So, that leads one to interesting places and interesting discussions. We need to do the research. We need to get the evidence. The good news is there's a lot of money and a lot of work going into that. And you're also seeing, and the point was made by the first speaker, whose name I'm sorry I've forgotten, but there's a broader look being taken on how projects are being approved, and the government's currently in the process of expanding sort of the scope of some of the environmental assessment processes that are underway. I'm not best placed to speak to all elements of that, but there's work going on. Sort of your last point, though, I put a caution on in terms of how much is enough or too much is sort of challenging, and it's hard to predict where industry will go. And the point of one of Chris's charts is to show that we have the government is committed to reducing impacts on environment, but also committed to expanding opportunities for the middle class, growing jobs, expanding trade, potentially negotiating trade with free trade with China. These will bring with it more trade. As Canada's economy grows, there will be more trade. The bulk of Canada's goods move by ship, and a vast majority of that actually these days, feeding Asia and importing goods from Asia, moves through the West Coast ports. But depending on how you view it, the fact that the ships are getting ever larger means that there's less traffic, even though, or the traffic does not grow in direct proportion to the volume of trade growth, which means hopefully we can have our cake and eat it too. But we have to take the measures to increase on an ever-increasing basis the safety.
Thank you. I'd like to, with 8 minutes remaining for those guests that need to leave at 11:30 sharp, which are the port authorities, if I'm not mistaken, I would like to be able to focus the remaining questions for the next 8 minutes to the port authorities. So I'll pick up again here where we left off. But who has specific questions for the port authority? So I'm seeing most everybody. So let's get to the port authority questions, and I didn't see one here, so I'm going to go with Lord James.
And I'm sorry, I'm not absolutely sure it's for the Port Authority. Following on from the question, when do we know enough is enough? My question is, what happens when we decide enough and enough? So specifically looking at the Gabriola proposed anchorages, what would the options be if for some reason it was found that these proposed new anchorages were not possible off of Gabriola? Say glass sponge reefs were found throughout the area. What options exist?
I'm going to move to the next speaker if you don't have an obvious answer, because I really want to focus on the port authority.
I think that was an answer.
Let us see if we can get back to you with something on that, okay?
But I can tell you, if pushed to an extreme, vessels, if they can sail in circles, that's a means of dealing with that. That's not the best from an airship or environment perspective either, and has noise implications and all of the rest. If anchoring is safer, then ultimately, if we, let's say we went through a full environmental assessment and everything process that we designated, there is a mechanism in Canada for this. At the end of an environmental assessment process, things go to the Governor and Council, which is Cabinet sitting in a regulatory form. There's a regulatory consultation process, and Cabinet can decide whether, notwithstanding significant impacts on the environment, something is in a broader public interest, and they'll take that decision one way or the other. And that's the political will at the end of the day.
Maybe I could just add to that, from a port's in a competitive position, if our gateway becomes less attractive from an economic perspective to shippers, they will seek to move their goods through other ports, such as U.S. West Coast, for example, which means lost economy and opportunities for us here in BC, but it also means that all that trade that was destined for Canada is now coming up the roadways on the west coast of the U.S. and railways and so on. So again, an inefficient supply chain, if you look at the whole thing altogether, is a bad thing from an environmental perspective, from a consumer pricing perspective, and many other things. So ideally, you want to keep it as efficient as possible.
George Graham, Sullivan now.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to each of the speakers. I enjoyed the contribution you had to make, particularly Misty MacDuffie's, but I would because my mandate is preservation and protection. My question, it's clear that we're collectively engaged in an attempt to balance the requirements of several stakeholders, and the interests encompass economic, social, environmental, and community. My concern is that it's skewed. It's skewed against community and it's skewed against environment. And there's no better example than that. If we look at the constitution of the Southern Gulf Islands Anchorages Working Group that was convened by Transport Canada, that group comprises Pacific Pilotage Authority, the BC Coast Pilots, the Chamber of Shipping of British Columbia, the Port of Vancouver, the Shipping Federation of Canada, and the Nanaimo Port Authority and Transport Canada. If you are seriously interested in community and environmental issues, why isn't there a representative of community environmental issues, such as the Islands Trust, at that table representing those interests? And I simply a yes or no answer is all I want from each of you.
It wasn't a yes or no question.
The question is, can there be an Island Trust representative on the working group authority?
Would you support that?
During the public consultation phase, which comes after the assessment.
That's not the question. Yes or no?
So my understanding of that group is just that it's the group of people who, they're not doing a heck of a lot of, their work is consulting with the community and the First Nations and getting out and talking about the issue. It's not a decision-making body. So if there's a different way we can approach that, we're happy to have that conversation. But it's not a decision-making body. It was simply, essentially, the group of experts plus here, Pacific Pilotage Authorities and some others trying to work through the issue and go and make sure that there was an opportunity for people to engage and talk about it and bring those perspectives back. But if there's a different way to proceed on that, why not?
So with 2 minutes remaining, are there specific questions for either Captain Dahlgren or Robin Crisante or Chris Wellward of the Port of Metro Vancouver? Lee Middleton.
Thank you very much, and thank you for attending. I think we perhaps need to be clearer just in terms of where we stand, and that will allow us perhaps to get through some of the subtleties of the binding legislation here, which I think we all as citizens know, it is in our power to look beyond. If legislation is not currently addressing every value of our watershed, clearly there needs to be adjustment to legislation, but nor do we want to point out enemies. And I think it's just obvious there will be no anchorages off the northeast coast of Gabriel Island. It's just simply not going to fly in no matter way, shape, or form. And the sooner we have an honest conversation about that, the better off process will be for all of us down the road. And there is a mechanism through the IMO, and I think you're probably all aware of it, and particularly the port and the Chamber of Shipping, I think can show some real leadership here in getting on board with the particularly sensitive sea area designation. It's a mechanism through the IMO. It could be imperfect. It might not be as good as other mechanisms for conservation protection, but it's a mechanism that allows conversation about multiple use of a area with a significant resource fragility, a conversation to take place so that shippers' needs can be as best as possible met, as can the needs of communities and the ecosystem. So my specific question is, can you see the port and can you see the chamber engaging as leaders in driving for the PSSA designation to be made by the IMO for the waters of the Salish Sea?
Since you asked me to answer. I'll be quite frank, I have a mandate to engage on this, so I'll ask you to, if you want to, I left 30 copies of a press release we issued last Wednesday on World Oceans Day. I guess my comment at the beginning was very much focused on that, and I didn't talk about specifics, but it was very focused on the fact that we've got PSSA, National Marine Conservation Area, Marine Protected Areas, moratorium dialogue around anchorages, and I think, one, yes, we have committed to engage in that dialogue, so you might have not heard that before. Two, I'm not sure PSSA is the best one on a personal level, but that might be my lack of knowledge. So we're committed to the dialogue, absolutely. And I can't tell you that we're supportive of a PSSA. I wouldn't be able to tell you that today. But to have the conversation, absolutely. And yes, the conversation has to happen. That's why I brought up marine spatial planning in my opening remarks, because clearly you're all very engaged about it.
So I promised that I would let those that needed to catch their flight leave at 11:30, and I'm going to stick to that promise. So thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate taking the time out of the day, and then we'll continue the questions and answers with the remaining delegates after they've left. Thank you.
So again, thank you for inviting us. I apologize for leaving before we finish, but I have an operational issue. I've left cards here. Anyone who has a particular question for me, please feel free to take a card, contact me at your convenience. We can either arrange a conference call, however it needs to be. We want to hear what you have to say, and we need to reflect it. But remember, I'm a director of a port. I'm not the CEO or the head of the board. So I need to engage people. I need to take back those messages to the bigger machine. And all the ports have to be on the same page. They can't work in isolation. So again, thank you, and we appreciate your concern, Karen.
Thank you. I promised I would pick up where I left off, although the questions seem to be all over the place. Over here, did George Harris have any questions at all? And Laura, you asked her a question. George, you asked a question. So Lee Middleton, I think you asked a question. And Eric Matz of Peter Grove, I think, is busy doing emails.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation and I guess the clarity on the process. I'm sitting here and it feels a lot like the War in the Woods that we went through in the 80s, where we have a difference in values, where we've got an economy that is willing to sacrifice what we hold near and dear, and it's being positioned, maybe I'm being unfair, but it's being positioned like we're a bunch of NIMBYs out here that are concerned about our views being obstructed by these activities, which I know and fully appreciate that we're engaged in. Because I'm wearing plastic, I know that our consumption patterns are increasing. I understand that there's 8 million people that live on these shores. And I guess what I'm hearing is a desire, and I've got a question from the floor about public's participation in this, and this isn't going away. You know, I just attended a meeting on Sartlip, traditional territory, and people are convening, and they're mustering together to try to stop this. And I think there's a frustration, both with the way that people are being considered in this. We're now looking to First Nations because we know that they hold more power than we do. We don't have a role, really. I mean, I appreciate George's question, but we really don't have the legislative power. We don't have that privilege of being able to sit as members, decision-making body. But First Nations do. And they have, I think we're increasingly looking at them to rescue us from ourselves. And which is incredibly ironic.
Do you have a question, Trustee?
Yeah, I do. No, and I'm positioning this because we're all engaged in this. And this isn't about pointing fingers and saying, you know, and I think it's easy for us to do this, sort of say, you know, the ships offshore, you know, they're filled with stuff and we don't like them and we understand the impacts. But we're all engaged in this economy. And so it strikes me, and we've talked a lot about process, is that we have a process in place that really isn't engaging people in this challenge that our society faces. And I was, you know, a couple weeks ago, I was doing some background research. We had this discussion before in the 60s. In the 60s, before the Island Trustees was established, there was a real concern about shipping and industrial activities. There was a desire for a cross-boundary marine park. We're seeing that the Island Trust was created as kind of a stopgap measure against development of the landscape, but there was concerns about marine issues. We're at that point again. We've sort of pushed it aside. We, you know, 40 years ago, gave ourselves sort of that kind of room. But we're at a point now where we need to figure this out, and we need a process in place that allows people here that are in the room to participate in a real way. First Nations to participate. How do we manage this territory? How do we manage this? You know, Misty provided that watershed area, that marine, which we now know as the Salish Sea. How do we do this? And so I guess my question for you is, and I know you can't give it, but I
feel this is so fair.
But this is something that you can take back, because, you know, we're hearing this from the federal government saying that we're really interested in how we engage, we're really interested in developing a new relationship with First Nations. Fundamentally, this is about reconciliation, not just about interpersonal relations, but also our relationship with the environment. And so I guess my question to you, and it's a challenge, is there's a deep desire for a process that really gets us around this wicked problem that we're facing, so that we can figure out how do we do this. 8 million people with an economy that's extractive, that is a single bottom line economy, when we need to move to something that's a triple bottom line economy. And I'm really interested if there is an interest from particularly the federal government about helping us to convene that, because we don't know how to do that. And this will continue. There will be more and more meetings, and we've got lots of examples. We've got hope, though, because the War in the Woods, we were able to come around as a community of interest to figure this out. And I think that's the opportunity that exists, is if you're really interested in participating, are there resources, is there attention, is there interest in doing something different? Thank you.
Do you have an answer for the statement?
Where's the Prime Minister when you need him?
I've invited him.
That's kind of a high order question. He's in Vancouver tomorrow. Where will you be?
You know, look, I wasn't around in the 60s, and I haven't looked back at the exact history, so I won't comment on that. This government has signaled a desire and an intention to engage as much as possible. There are many channels to do that, there are many approaches to do that. I think the government's also looking to try different ways and approaches, so I don't think it's going to be one formula, one way. We're totally open to ideas on what and how, and if people bring concrete suggestions, you know, we'll certainly take that back and listen to them. We're doing in our department and with others a ton of work in communities up and down this coast, in particular with the different coastal First Nations, the Chinchon, the Salish people, and we're in their communities, we're meeting with leaders, we're meeting with communities, we're talking about concerns, we're listening, we're explaining. It's a mutual process, and it's iterative and it's not perfect, but I think everybody sort of agrees it's getting better than it was, and that's kind of the best benchmark I've got on that, and we can expand that with others. It takes time, it takes resources, and those things are not infinite. And it doesn't always lead to consensus, And it certainly doesn't always lead to everybody being happy. So at a certain point, decisions have to be taken. This is a regional governance body. I know you appreciate that. No doubt you take decisions that are not always the most popular, but you are paid to decide. You are elected to decide. What are the processes by which we get there? Perhaps listen to any specific suggestions. Welcome. We'll always look at anything. It's important to realize that this is also a national conversation. And there are national tables that are where there's consultations going right now. My minister, Minister MacDuffee, Minister of Transport, is out engaging on the David Emerson-led Canadian Transportation Act review, and in response to that, he's doing different stuff, like Facebook town halls, Facebook Live, Facebook events, targeted roundtables, all sorts of different things. So there's almost, like there's so many channels and places to consult and engage. What I think is becomes an interesting thing to guard against is, doing more and more of it in multiple places. Is it satisfying people? Is it delivering the result that people want? We'll have to take stock and assess that nicely. Only you can answer that. In a sense, we'll have a view on how it's serving our needs to inform and then arrive at decision making in a timely and resource respectful way, because it's all taxpayer money at the end of the day. But you'll have a perspective too, and I'd like to hear it. So I'm not sure that I can go a lot further than that, but I do underscore that when you start talking about values and what we want as a society, there's local community interest, but there's also other local communities' interest, and it has to become a national conversation. And that's very much the place. My colleague who sits in transport headquarters and deals with marine policy on a national basis is struck by the different perspectives and concerns, some of which are shared, but others of which are highly variable across this country about marine traffic. Only 3% of energy movement by ship goes through the West Coast. The vast majority goes through the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Atlantic. The nature of the concern is entirely different. The nature of the desired response is entirely different. How do we balance this? Because we need nationally coherent regimes. So these are things that we're grappling with, but happy to have conversations.
Can I,
Thank you.
I think you've hit a nail on the head of an important topic, and I just wanted to give you an industry perspective. And I don't represent the whole industry. Industry isn't a perfect entity. It has various factions. Take it with a grain of salt. 5 years ago, do you think that my board would have sat around a table talking about dialogue with First Nations? No. Ships turn slowly, and industry changes slowly. However, we had a board meeting yesterday, and we are talking about how dialogue happens, where we fall in that dialogue. And I think it's pretty clear probably to this audience that it's nation to nation, and then the rest of us. And that's how this federal government is approaching their information gathering, consultation, policy development. It's black and white for me. It's so clear. I'm not sure all Canadians see that. You probably work in an environment that's a bit unique than a lot of others. So that changes. I guess my point is there is change happening. So even industry is starting to go, wow, something's changed. What do we do to change with it? And you don't want to become like the forestry industry or the mining industry and be driven to the brink of extinction before you adapt to the environment that you're operating in. So on a positive note, I think there is adaptation happening, and it will take positive momentum, and that's why I speak about this a lot, about how to change process, engagement, and objectives. And I don't think there's anybody that would question your triple bottom line these days. It's part of doing business. Nobody wants to operate in an environment where you're not supported by stakeholders. So how to get there, a lot more difficult. It's not simple. And that's why I think it's important to listen to success stories, look for those success stories, and try to do them again. So small pieces. So our number one objective, and since I've arrived, we're working on formal policy objectives. They're not completely finished yet, but I know that the top theme is going to be about spatial planning, consultation, engagement. It's clear because you are a constituent base that is sending signals, but there's lots of constituencies that are sending signals about how they expect. And I was around in the 60s, although I was pretty young. And I think a lot's changed since then. It may be the same dialogue, but we know a lot more now. So if we know a lot more, we have to adapt and use that information. And a lot of industry only has so much, right? Industry knows economics, they know how their industry works, how it doesn't work. So it can't solve those things by itself, nor should it try to solve those things by itself.
Thank you, Robert Louis Manning. I'm observing and I've heard that there's a breath of fresh air in the Chamber of Shipping, and I'm pleased to have you here and hear you speak today. So thank you for that. My mother always told me to lead by example, and I skipped over myself about the question that I had, and I'll continue on the table here in a minute. But I'm going to ask a question that seems to be critical in terms of our decision making later on in the Trust Council session. Robert, Dick, you had suggested earlier that there was no authority to designate anchorages anywhere by anybody. You also had suggested that it required an act of Parliament to restrict any kind of shipping activity or right of navigation. We have a motion coming up for us for decision about creating a moratorium on anchorages directed at Transport Canada. It strikes me that that needs to be directed to Parliament, and I'd like your answer to that question is that who is the authority to invoke a moratorium or restriction on anchorage?
That would require legislative authority, is my understanding, in order to do that absent a specific, as I said, Transport Canada can prohibit anchoring for a specific safety concern for a period of time, but absent that reason, on a more general basis, which, to be clear, would then conceivably apply to any vessel anchoring of any size in a given location. There'd have to be a basis for that was consonant with other regimes. That I, to the best of my knowledge, but I'm not the definitive, by far, legal authority on this. That's that would require some form of legislative authority.
An act of Parliament.
Likely.
Okay.
Thank you. There are people who study this in the law for decades, and I'm not aware of it.
We've got 11 minutes remaining before our break, so...
Danielle, do you have a clarification?
Oh.
I think we have a Minister of Transport, for the purpose of answering your question.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
I'm putting my poor staff on the spot.
And again, I'm not an expert on this either, but I believe for the purpose of your question, which is who do you direct your resolution towards, I think the Act of Parliament would have to be proposed by the Minister of Transport.
Thank you, then.
So
excellent.
That would be your answer.
That's a really great answer. David Christie from Nanaimo.
Thank you.
Unless you had something else to add, sorry.
I'll just note that in effect you have that, right? Because what no ship anchors without the pilots escorting it there and saying it's okay. And while we could never say we would never allow a ship to use an anchorage, out of respect for the process, the Pacific Pilotship Authority pilots are not taking vessels there, which has been easier to do because there haven't been a ton of vessels requiring anchorages recently. But again, if ever a vessel required a safe anchorage, they would take it where it was safe. But in practical terms, they're making every effort to avoid that right now and choose other locations to the extent that that's feasible.
Thank you. David Christie.
Yes, I have one question, but another one has come to mind in view of the last question. So just following on with that, in the statutory framework, to expand the Port of Nanaimo, does that require an act of Parliament, or is that an order in council matter?
It's a governor and council matter. It would be the letters of patent would go to cabinet sitting as GIC through Treasury Board. It would be a regulatory change. It would be gazetted,
yes.
Which involves a formal consultation and engagement process.
So if I might be permitted to ask the question that I really want to ask, which is pretty direct.
Ask the permission of the members south of you. They know that, right? Go ahead.
Thank you.
But hurry.
Yeah, I want to ask about parking fees. So if you are exercising your common law right to park anchor anywhere you want, presumably that costs you nothing. If you are going to park in a designated spot, which is something that is created through a port authority, there is a charge. Can you give me some idea of the basis on which those charges are made and what they would amount to on a daily basis for, say, your average tanker?
No. Where's a port authority when you need one? They just left. But they have, under the Canada Marine Act, they have the authority to set and collect fees. And certainly one of the things that has been observed, is industry response to economic levers and incentives and disincentives. And the fact that something is, it'd be a mistake to say that it's a total free good to stay at an anchor. It's a free good in terms of the anchorage, but the pilotage authority fees really add up to move the vessel, to get the pilots on and off the ship. So it's not quite so simple as that, but certainly if an anchorage is within the bounds of a port authority and the port authority's boundaries were included these other anchorages, then you can, port authorities can work together to change the costs, and they can set, as far as I know, they can set them based on anything they want, mainly to motivate or incent behavior, and it can be to smooth out the supply chain, it can be to disincent usage of certain anchorages at certain times. There could be all sorts of things conceivably in the pricing mechanism, but the details of the actual, what it costs them, I'm not going to answer you. That's a port authority question.
You done?
South Pender,
Pumper Sound is near and dear to my heart for many, many years. So this question relates to the Pumper Sound. Just over a year ago, and this is maybe a Port Authority thing, but maybe Robert, you could answer this. The Port Authority redesignated the anchorages in Pumper Sound on a temporary basis for analysis. I haven't heard anything as to, because it was supposed to be within a year to determine those anchorages, and but there's been no public consultation with that regard too, or none that I've been made aware of at all with regards to our reaction to the new anchorages. You also mentioned earlier, I forget who it was, but pilot determines who goes to what particular designated anchorage, and we've been having some problems with the CSL ship and where it continues to go and do its industrial activity, which is the closest point to the penders that you could possibly be, with absolutely no consultation and no help in regards of why don't you move to the A, B, or C position. You keep going to the same D position, which is the most disruptive, both noise, lights, and they start their activity at midnight and run for 12 hours through the night, hoping that we don't notice the occasional dust plumes that you were made aware of today. But I'm just wondering, is there going to be a public consultation process in that regard? Quick answer, then I have one quick question for Christy.
And I don't have great answers, but I'll give them to you straight up. One, my board asked me the same question yesterday about the pilot project to look at the redesignation or the relocation of some of those anchorages, and I had the same answer for them. I'm not sure, but I need to check, so I will come back to you about that. Two was related to the actual anchorages within Plumper Sound, and specifically what's happening day to day for you, and I think I've committed to following up with you. I don't know, is a quick answer, but I will follow up with you. So, did I miss one of your questions?
I've got a bunch more, but I'm going to that's good for the moment here, and then because of time, I just a quick question for Christy then. You've been sitting there so quietly. When Chris Wellwood mentioned the vessel calls per day now are 9 per day, increasing in 10 years to 12 per day. Quick calculating, there's 18 transits then if down along past Churn Point and up around the corner towards Port of Vancouver, and that's going to increase to 24 per day. I don't think they were taking into account the potential increase in the tanker traffic too. So my quick question to you is, are you making any progress in advancing your issues that you brought up today?
Boy, you know what, I might rely on CPAWS and Georgia Strait Alliance about progress on these shipping issues. I think that the awareness of them is definitely grown, but I think the important thing is going to be to get a pause while we fully understand this. So do you guys have more insight into whether you think there's progress being made?
On shipping.
Yeah.
No, I mean, every shipping proposal is being looked at in a silo.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is no, at least there's no public cumulative look at the shipping projects and the impact. So that's where we're not seeing the progress. Or if there are conversations happening, they're not happening for all of us.
I'd like to move to the next trustee's question for the time remaining, because they've been waiting the longest. Trustee Morris.
Well, I think the first question I was going to ask has been discussed. This whole bit about the transportation review. So David Emerson's report was received by the federal government in February, if I'm reading my little bit of web searching right now. So is the review that you're talking about, this Canadian Transportation Agency announced comprehensive regulatory review, is that the public consultation part?
No.
Or is there a review of public consultation with respect to David Emerson's report? So there's actually two things going on.
There are two things going on. So David Emerson and a panel, an independent panel, conducted an independent review of the Canada Transportation Act. The Canada Transportation Act is the framework piece of legislation under which all of the other stuff sits, and it sets out how and for what purposes transportation is regulated in this country. And currently, Article 5 says, there's a long, beautiful flowing paragraph, but it amounts to, with some lawyers wrote it, right? So some subsections, but it's fundamentally, we want a safe, secure, clean, and efficient transportation system in Canada with a minimum of government intervention only to deal with market failures and to ensure safety and security and environmental regulation. So David Emerson reviewed that over the course of the year, provided his report to the government in December. That obviously straddled two governments. This government has received the report, is considering it, and now that everybody's seen it, is going out and asking stakeholders, so how are you reacting to this? What do you kind of think of the different recommendations they've made? And that process is going on now to inform whatever next steps this government will choose to take with that, and you're encouraged to participate in that. Separately, the Canadian Transportation Agency, which is, again, an independent tribunal that deals with economic regulation and implementing dispute resolution. So, for instance, if you're a passenger who's not satisfied with the complaint process at an airline and they've lost your bags and not compensated you, you can apply to them for an administrative tribunal. They are looking, following on Minister Emerson's review as well, what impact it might have to them and their suite of economic regulations. And so the chair of that, Scott Striner, recently announced that he would be engaging in that process. So they are distinct.
Can you just add a little bit more about how we get engaged in the review of David Emerson's report?
There's all sorts of different streams to that, and I hope there's some information on our website. If not, I'll get back to you. But I know there was a Facebook Live event. I don't actually really know what a Facebook Live event is, but on Thursday? This Thursday, there's one, and they're oriented around different chapters of the report or different elements. So there's one on the travel experience, covering everything from all modes of transport. There's one on, for shippers. Anyway, there's all sorts of the marine, the air, et cetera, et cetera. And it involves those public outreach through social media, as well as targeted consultations.
Thank you. I'm going to hold you all ransom for a little longer yet, and then I'm going to turn to Diane Barber to tell us about the tour and lunch. But Tony Law, you look at.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the only person who felt a disconnect between the first presentations and the subsequent ones. In the first presentation, we heard that orcas are at a point of possible recovery and likely decline if things continue. We heard that environment is balanced with other issues, but the environment is finite. We heard about environment being the triple bottom line, but it's not the triple bottom part of the triple bottom line, it's the foundation of all life. So I'd like to know who is doing the balancing between environmental issues, such as the ones of the impact on marine mammals, and how is that being done?
Another perfect answer. Who's doing putting it all together, I think, is the basis of your question. I don't think anybody is personally yet. Where I think there is change is, I think within certain federal departments, we're starting to see a more holistic view to measuring the impact of industrial activity on the environment, and then a really solid dialogue about how to incent change. So I'll give you an example. Environment and Climate Change Canada is now doing roundtable sessions across Canada, and they are looking at transportation as one piece of that working group. And they're looking at it from a holistic view. So, if you want to talk about air emissions, I think there really is some progress in looking at things more holistically. I think Department of Fisheries and Oceans is starting to. They're including transportation now as a stakeholder, where I don't think our industry would probably talk to DFO in 2 decades. So that's change. It's probably not change at the rate you want it, but there is some change. Transport Canada, and I was being polite deliberately. I think Transport Canada is under incredible strains right now. I think they are being brought into that, and there certainly is departmental dialogue on these issues. But one of the advocacy themes that we have is to make sure that the Coast Guard and Transport Canada and DFO are properly resourced to have that conversation. So, it's a place probably where our interests align a significant amount, because they need to have the resources, they need to have the mandate, the authority to have that dialogue. So I've never missed the chance to talk to a regional director, because it's a big deal to have a regional director for this much time. So I'll take advantage of having the mic as well.
Thank you. Who else along that chain? Trustee Allen? One beyond?
Yeah, my question is on responder training at the grassroots level, and given that San Juan County has 300 Islander responders in oil spill response, and the BC Ministry of Environment may consider just-in-time training to handle large or prolonged oil spill response. Is there any opportunity and funding for training islanders in oil spill response?
This is a really live topic for us, and we're looking at options now. It's coming up a lot, and we're trying to figure out what the best approach is. So is there currently funding? No. Could there be, and it might be something that we look at as we reframe how we do this, potentially in conjunction. This is so potentially, I don't want to, I just have to underscore that. But the province is out right now talking about their proposed legislation for land-based spill response regime. We're engaged actively with communities, especially First Nations communities, around the marine environment and where we go next. This government has a commitment. It's in my minister's mandate letter to strengthen marine safety and security, and we're taking that very seriously, and we think there is scope to improve. And an interesting question that Coast Guard is grappling with, that the province is grappling with, and that we are, is how do we do the first response? And somebody earlier, I'm sorry, I've now lost track, but somebody earlier talked about WCMRC's 3 depots. I'm not sure that's quite the right number, but that it can take time to deploy. One, we're looking through the area response planning at changing the time to deploy those things, but 2, we're looking in certain areas over whether there should be other first responders trained. And we saw both in search and rescue with the Leviathan 2 and the tragedy of Tofino, that First Nations went out first. They're on the water. There's local knowledge about where people will be, and we know that could be the circumstance as well. So both we and Western Canada Marine Response, and I strongly suspect the province, are looking at what ought that role to be, how do you equip and train, but also how do you integrate it into a system? Because in most places we have a sort of layered response, right? I mean, response is, you first call your local fire department for the fire in the bush, and they come, and if they need more resources, they phone a few more stations, or maybe an adjoining city, and then the province comes in with 4 fires, and if necessary, the army comes in, and if need be, they draw on international force firefighters, right? Like, you bring in staged, tiered, escalating response capability. So we're looking at how could that work. in this environment, and we'd like to see it married up well with the BC land-based spill response regime, bearing in mind that we deal with this at a national level, so we can't have a bunch of fragmented approaches in different places. Not because we're just sort of opposed to that on a philosophical level, but also because practically you need interoperability. People move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. They need to know that it's the same so that bad stuff doesn't happen and accidents get made and lives get lost. So we want to figure out the best way to do that, and I think there's lots of scope for it, but we're in the process of looking at it. We're not there yet.
Thank you. Trustee Paul Brent. Sojourner Island.
Quick one, I heard today, and I know that tankers, container ships, ro-ros, they don't generally anchor. So there's obviously a way to handle that. Container traffic is a huge component of Port Metro Vancouver. I wonder, as a solution to anchorage, if there's some way to have slow steaming, not vessels going in circles, which is grossly inefficient, but slow steaming, which reduces fuel, reduces noise, and is a potential solution to anchorages. Is that being looked at actively by Transport Canada?
Pardon me? Speak up so that I can hear you. So we only assert a modicum of control once people enter Canada's economic zone. So what happens at sea, we don't really control. We can motivate an incent if we can charge, not we transport, but as a country or the different authorities charge different amounts for anchorages. But ships end up at anchor for a multiplicity of reasons. It can be issues with supply chain, but it can also be bad weather. On route here towards destination, it could be somebody's between jobs. And then you also have to ask yourself, where is it safest for those people to be? If there are people aboard the ships, do you want them steaming out in the open seas, or are they actually safer at anchor? And those things would have to weigh in that decision making, but I don't know where we're at exactly on advocating or promoting that. What do you think of that?
Well, I would just add that, that if the pilots were here, what they would likely say is that they certainly take that into account when they're once they board the ship and they're taking the ship into port. They're aware of scheduling, and they would slow the ship down or speed the ship up to accommodate those kinds of things. I've heard them say that, give that kind of answer in the past, but as Robert pointed out, it's not simply the arrival schedule that is dictating whether a ship goes to anchor or not, because it does go to anchor in the middle of loading and unloading.
Thank you. This is really early stages on this topic. I think we're trying to have a look around the world to see if there's another model that is currently in use. And it comes back to, I think one of the trustees from Gabriola mentioned about how much is enough, or what enough looks like, or how do you manage sustainability when you've got more information. And I think how we manage the flow of vessels is something that we probably need to spend some academic rigor on with all the science in order to see if there's a different model. Because right now it's the parking lot model. Right? The constraints of the entire supply chain arrive at the port, and it could be a problem upstream or downstream. You don't know.
But not for containers, not for ro-ros, not for tankers.
Not historically. You're right.
Okay.
Right. Because, I'm sorry, maybe I'm missing your point then.
Well, if we can do it for containers, of which there's a lot of volume, vessel traffic,
Okay,
and we can do it for ro-ros, and we can do it for tankers, then we need the discipline for basically the bulk, and they give laycan notices. And when we have supply chain failures, there's a build-up. And so it's not like this is a surprise. We know there's a bunch of vessels coming, and we know there's no place for them to go because the terminals are packed, or they don't have the product. We know that. We know that in industry because I've been in the industry, so we know this crap is going to happen, and these things are going to be at anchor for days and days and days, and it costs these companies lots of money, so they're focused on it.
slow steaming.
There may be solutions there. I'm not saying, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. There's some commercial realities of how the grain industry changed with the disappearance of the wheat board, and it sounds like you're fairly knowledgeable on that. I don't think we're through all that change. And you'll see if you look closely at Vancouver, there's been some growth in grain terminals. There's some change in railways, maybe some diversion of cargo to Prince Rupert. Those are all things I think that play into the economics around moving grain.
Thank you. And the final question for Trustee Hunter from CITES.
Well, I think the topic has been well discussed, and in the interest of time, I'd just like to thank the panel very much for coming out today and for a very interesting session. Thank you.
So thank you, Trustee Hunter, indeed, thank you very much. And apologies to the public for not having the resources or time for questions from the public. I hope that you found the questions from your elected representatives and the answers meaningful, and we will be moving forward with this dialogue. I will note that we had tried very hard, and Claire tried very hard to get representation from the Pacific Powers Authority here, which is an important part of the equation. That was unsuccessful, and perhaps that might come at a later date in the future, hard to say, it depends on the direction of council. But I'm going to closing remarks to Robert Dick, and then I'm going to go to Diane Barber to tell us about the tour, which is waiting.
Well, first, I'm here in part, and I'm very glad to have been here, though a more detailed and knowledgeable person would have been the Regional Director of Marine Safety and Security of Myers, who was with the CEO of the Pacific Pilotage Authority, Kevin Obermeyer, in the UK. They've raised $30,000 for seafarers, and they are doing hiking 3 peaks within 24 hours of the United Kingdom for the seafarers mission, so I think that's a pretty good reason to be away. Thanks very much for the opportunity to come. Always happy to come and engage, and I'll be around for a little bit if people do.
Thank you for that reminder. All of these people